I have spent years in conversation with people who are successful by every measure and still quietly restless. Not broken, not lost, just aware somewhere underneath the noise that there is a version of their life that feels more honest, more grounded, more genuinely theirs. This podcast exists for those people, for the ones who are done performing and ready to go deeper. My name is Dr. Doug. Welcome to Inspire Vision. I am glad you are here. Valerie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Dr. Doug. It's just been a pleasure talking to you so far, so I'm excited to be here.
I'm looking forward to it. It's interesting your approach to relationships, and so I'm always curious as to what is your background and what were your life experiences that brought you to the point that you're doing what you're doing now and working with women and helping them in their relationships?
Yeah, thank you so much. It is, kind of a long journey for me. I'm 47, so, I've definitely been through my share of life experiences at this point. But kind of rewinding all the way back, my parents had a happy marriage for them, so I got good modeling in many ways, and they were very loving towards me. And at the same time, they had their own blind spots, as everybody does. So I actually never received actual empathy until I was 30. Um, and I'm an extremely empathic person myself, so I grew up feeling really confused. My parents' philosophy on emotions was, it's okay to feel that way, but think this way instead, which gave me really great training for challenging my thoughts. And I'm very grateful for that because to this day, I don't really believe my thoughts. But, I mean, obviously I question my thoughts. I believe some of them, it's not like I don't believe any of them. But it was a very good mentorship in that way. My parents were actually disciples of Gurdjieff when I was growing up. And so it was all about, know yourself and get to know your thinking. And I was also raised Protestant starting at the age of 7. So I got a really good foundation in how to be present and personal growth oriented, but not a lot in terms of emotions. And I'm an extremely emotional person. So I just grew up very confused. And my dad had a lot of love, but he also was, his life experiences led him to not know really healthy conflict resolution. So we basically argued constantly when I was a kid. And so that's what I brought into my relationships when I was in my 20s, all throughout my 20s until through my first marriage. Now I'm happily married to my current husband, but I would sweep conflict under the rug, pretend everything was fine, but then I didn't have any better strategies other than arguing in order to resolve conflict. So it would reach a certain threshold, and then I would criticize and, pick fights, but not meaning to. I just didn't know what else to do because that's what I learned. And so then it was like wash, rinse, repeat, unfortunately, with all the relationships I had in my 20s, that they would start out with a lot of passion, but then eventually we would grow apart or we'd just be fighting all the time to the point where we'd be sleeping in separate beds and, kind of not really getting along. And it just made me realize that I'm the common denominator. So I actually started out as a health coach in my mid-20s because I didn't feel like I was qualified enough to coach people on their relationships, considering that mine were kind of fraught. But I was always passionate. Like I just had this passion to learn how to resolve conflict and to have a harmonious relationship. That was really what I read avid books on. So in my private time, that's what I was reading and studying. And then, of course, because of that, it turned out that when I hired a business coach after doing a couple of years of health coaching, it wound up that that's what I wound up helping my clients with the most was their relationships. Even though they would come to me for stopping emotional eating, let's say, And then I would teach them emotional tools, but they would open up to me about their relationships, and then I would help them with the advice that I had, and, ask them really curious questions because I was good at that. And then they would have epiphanies about their relationships, and then their relationships would improve, and then they would stop needing to use food to mask their unpleasant feelings because they knew how to be vulnerable with their partner and work it out, So it was just funny because I always had unconscious competence. And so eventually I realized that that was my passion and my proclivity. So that's when I went back to school for relationship coaching, and I went to the Relationship Coaching Institute, which has a really good program for singles and couples. And then I also did a lot of emotional healing training. Like I learned emotionally focused therapy with the student of Sue Johnson, and I did the Gottman trainings, and really have now a robust toolkit. And of course I also use those, and it was really in my first marriage that I had kind of a dojo, so to speak, to put all this in practice, because we unfortunately didn't realize until we were married that there were a lot of incompatibilities. And so I was passionate that we weren't, we were going to make it through, and that, we, at the very least, if we didn't, we weren't going to end the relationship out of anger. We were really going to be on the same team no matter what. So we worked with coaches and therapists, and I became a teacher of nonviolent communication. And it's funny, I actually hung a sheet of feelings and needs on our wall back then, because this was before they had all the NVC apps. Now they have a lot of apps that on the, for the phones of feelings and needs. But back then I hung a sheet on the wall, and we'd be arguing, and I'd be like, okay, take a time out. And then I would soothe my nervous system and look at the sheet and come back and give him empathy and express my feelings and needs with an open heart. And that was really the training ground for me to be able to learn how to resolve conflict. And unfortunately, after 2 years of that, we realized that we actually did want different things out of life and out of marriage. But to this day, we're on good terms. And he even wrote an endorsement on my website. And so that's when I really knew that I had healed my blocks to unconditional love through that process. And I'm infinitely grateful that, that we went through that portal together, so to speak, so that now with my current husband, I can be happily married. And, because of that, I actually have niches of both helping couples resolve conflict and singles to date strategically to avoid situationships and truly have this, what I call soul shaking love, where you're connected deeply on multiple levels. And so that's what I specialize in. And I get really good results with my clients because I have such an integrative approach.
Okay, so you bring up a number of things, and I think probably the first question that comes to my mind, and you talked about the fact that you help singles, but you talked about your experience of getting married and then realizing the incompatibilities that were just not resolvable. So my question is, as you work particularly with the single people and single ladies, how do you help them, if you do, to identify more closely those compatibilities and incompatibilities so that they don't experience what you experienced in your first marriage?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's really hard to do this if you don't have mentorship. I'm not saying that you need to work with me, but there's numerous books. I actually really like the book that's written by David Steele, who's the founder of the Relationship Coaching Institute, because he has a distinction about separating wants from needs. And I think that's incredibly important because we all have a list of things that we want in a potential partner, but most people don't really know how to tell the difference between wants and needs, and also between interests and values. Because, so for example, we'll talk about wants and needs first. So I might want somebody who has a certain level of education or has a certain, we all have a type, right? Like who looks a certain way, who acts a certain way, who, they have the qualities that really turn us on. And there's nothing, of course, we want to be turned on by the person. So I always say that, if you're turned off by the person or there's no chemistry, obviously don't proceed. But what winds up happening with most people is that we follow chemistry and we just assume that things will work out if there's good chemistry. And that's chemistry is important, but if all you have is chemistry, then after the honeymoon phase is over, then you're left with what creates good chemistry going forward is being able to have secure attachment, being able to speak each other's love language, really having compatible values that you're committed to upholding together, and being able to really meet each other's attachment needs, as well as having a shared purpose. Because that's actually what John Gottman's research shows, is that the biggest reason that couples say that they break up when they do is that they've lost a shared vision for the future. So it's just incredibly important. So that's the main things that I focus on with singles, is the vision for the culture that you want to co-create in your relationship, and then also values and also needs. So now I'll kind of break that down.
So I want to get into that a little bit more first.
Yeah.
We talk about values, and I happen to be a behavioral analyst also, and one of the things I find is that, and you brought it up, that we grow up with all of these different beliefs and belief systems that in many cases are very subconscious, and we don't even realize how much they're affecting us.
Yep.
And at the same time, our values that we believe are our values are oftentimes the values of our parents, our religion, our society, our friends, whatever that happens to be. So
Yes.
How do you, I know I do it because I have a very specific program that I use, but how do you help people to really delve into what their true values are rather than what they've been told their values should be?
Yeah, that's such a good question. There's an exercise that I have in my book, The Commitment Roadmap, that leads people through an exercise to tell their values. And so there's a series of questions that I ask. And one of them is, think about the happiest time in your life. And what made you happy? Like, not what was going on the surface, but I give people a list of values to look at and say, what value is being honored when you were truly happy? And because this is the superficial exploration, is just identifying them as words on a sheet of paper. Values are things like, because you could value something like the values that I share with my current husband are unconditional love and wisdom and shared spiritual practice, personal growth, healing, embodiment, fun, play, and authenticity. So, those are kind of examples of values. But identifying the words are superficial. Then we go deeper. So that's the first question, is, when were you the happiest? The second is, tell me about a time that you were unhappy and what value was not being honored. So it's really in not, and if there's a should, then we'll identify that in the next part. But, because usually if there's, why is that important to you? Well, because you should, then it's something that is not, authentic necessarily. It's something that you have a belief based on your upbringing or your culture that you should have it. And the third thing is, like, how do you want your friends and family to be toasting you on your 80th birthday? They're all gathered around and they say, how have you contributed to our lives? Like, what do you want them to be saying about you? And then also, what do you want your legacy to be? And, so those are like a sampling of questions to be able to find the words. But then we do the deeper exploration as to, why is that important to you? And that's when it really comes out, because if somebody values something like success or achievement or accomplishment, sometimes that's really authentic, and people have ambitious goals. And that really makes them come alive. And other times, oh, well, because I should, because that's what my parents said was important, or that's what I think women want, or that's what I think men want, or whatever, so that's the next question that I ask is like, why? Why is that important to you? And then how do you know when you're embodying it? What does it look like and feel like for you when you're embodying that value? And then also, what does it look like and feel like if you're sharing that value with a partner? So I have people do that exploration again with the values, because the values that you have in your individual life might be, of course, they should be overlapping. And I always use the word should as like, and for the sake of efficiency, I mean, like it would be better to
Okay.
because like I value efficiency, but I don't should on myself anymore.
Okay, so as we're talking about, that, and I always have said that, to prevent a situation is so much better than having to correct it later on. So, one of your talking points that I saw that was interesting was the cycle of attracting unavailable men. And, we're going to get into why you're focusing on women and not men, but you probably help men too. But what is it? What has been your experience? Why do women attract unavailable men? What's
hmm
what's going on there?
Yeah, and you're right. I do always have a couple of men in my practice, but for whatever reason, women have always been more drawn to me. So it's like you got to pick a niche, right? But I'd say that this question equally applies to men. And in fact, I think men, like I've worked with couples where it's the man who's emotionally available and it's the woman who's not. Maybe she has avoidant attachment or whatever. So I don't pigeonhole based on gender. But, so I guess I'll answer that question from the standpoint of why do people attract emotionally unavailable partners? Because I do think it's the same answer depending, for every gender. And so there's a lot that goes into that. First of all, we attract what feels familiar. Unfortunately, kind of like you're saying that most of our values and beliefs are unconscious. Well, so is our programming about what love is. It's mostly unconscious unless we make it conscious, through self exploration. But if we're just following chemistry, what chemistry means is that, you have that feeling like, oh my God, I feel like I've known you my whole life. Like if you get fireworks with somebody right off the bat, what that means is that they'll probably trigger you the way that your caretakers from childhood did. You don't know that yet, but, and so if you had really emotionally available parents and you felt like you could approach them with your feelings and they would comfort you and help you identify what you needed and help you work out the solution, then if you follow chemistry and it feels familiar, then the person's probably emotionally available. But if the modeling that you had growing up, or it doesn't have to be from parents, but I would argue that the beliefs that really run us were from 0 to 7, because that's what the research shows, right? But it could be that somebody was, cheated on in an early relationship, and then that gives them an imprint that
Right.
they then carry with them that feels familiar. So I'm not saying, and by the way, I'm not blaming parents. I really want to be very nuanced here, because it's not the parents' fault. People can only really parent the way they were parented if they don't have better modeling. And they don't have time to heal before they become parents. So, we don't know what we don't know. So it's not, I'm not blaming your parents if you attract emotionally unavailable partners. In fact, I think blame is being emotionally unavailable. So, you know, but so it's not in looking at why to kind of point the finger. It's looking at why to make sense of like, oh, it's not your fault that you never learned the skills of being emotionally available to yourself, which is kind of surprising to people. Like I thought that I was emotionally available to myself because I'm like, well, I think I was more emotionally available than a lot of people I knew, because we tend to attract people that are kind of like us. So I would compare myself in my 20s to my friends and be like, well, I know how I'm feeling. I feel happy, or I feel sad, or I feel angry, or I feel, scared, or whatever. But that doesn't mean I was emotionally available. It was sort of a blind spot for me because I was not emotionally available in my 20s. What emotional availability means to me is that I know how to not, because I was only modeled two ways of dealing with feelings, either suppressing them and pretending like I didn't feel bad because I could question my thoughts and okay, now I'll think differently and I feel differently, right? Or expressing them, like, I'm really angry because you didn't do this. Like, but I would argue that that's not necessarily emotionally available. What my definition of emotional availability is that I have the ability to sit with my feelings and tolerate them, and give myself empathy and compassion for my feelings, and identify what is it that I want or desire or need underneath the feeling, because
Okay.
that's
So
what yeah
go ahead, finish that sentence.
oh yeah, I mean, that's really what nonviolent communication teaches, is that feelings are caused by needs getting met or not met, and then I can look at it like I'm expressing what I desire and I'm curious about what you desire, and then we can work it out, so that's how I define emotional availability.
Okay, so really, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that if I'm not emotionally available, I am going to attract people who are not emotionally available. And so it comes back to me. It comes back to the individual who says, oh, well, they're not emotionally and that, blah, 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 blah. When in fact, they just need to hold up a mirror and say, all right, here's the problem. And the problem, if we want to use that word, I don't like that word, but
Yeah.
the issue is me. I have got to take personal responsibility for what's happening in my life. And therefore, I'm the one that needs to be able to work on this and figure things out. And as you say, as you start to become emotionally available, as you start to get rid of some of those imprints and those childhood shoulds,
Hmm.
that you're starting to attract someone differently. And that gets to be fascinating. But then we get into those people who are already in a relationship. And what I find interesting in the past is I've interviewed different relationship coaches, there seems to be a theme that is consistent. And that is that if you can change your own personal, and I would say emotional intelligence, which really has to do with that whole thing,
Yeah.
that all of a sudden you start to see your partner change also. And oftentimes, again, as you say, sometimes there's the incompatibilities are so great that you're not able to really resolve that. But in many cases, and particularly it seems like I'm interviewing the women and the women coaches on this,
Mhm.
but it seems like when they're able to change themselves, that all of a sudden they start to see their partner start to change also. And why is that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, I want to put a caveat on that it's not always, right? But what I would say before I answer that question, because I do agree with you in like 90% of the cases, that if and this more applies to singles, but it also applies to the relationship that you're talking about, the paradigm, that if I become more emotionally available to my own feelings rather than go on a date to try to, okay, I have to make the person like me, which, I coach a lot of people who focus more on the other person than how do I feel with them. When you're really focusing on being emotionally available to yourself, you won't be attracted to somebody who's emotionally available. Like it just won't interest you anymore. You'll know how to tell. So it's sort of the same thing in that relationship that you're talking about. But we'll get there. Now I'll answer the question you asked, which is like, why does the other person change when you change? And it's because relationships are a system. I actually love the way that emotionally focused therapy talks about it because they look at it like a cycle, like the it kind of looks like an infinity sign. Um, that when I am so in this infinity sign, at the bottom of each side is our vulnerable feelings and attachment and longings. But we don't know how to express those. We need to be emotionally available or have emotional intelligence to express those. So that's where we meet, is at the bottom. And but if we don't have that ability, then what we do is we make interpretations of the situation, which is kind of in the middle, like, well, here's what I think about that. And then because of those interpretations, we take action. The action's on the top. So let's say I am upset at my husband because he didn't keep an agreement that's not egregious, right? Like, I'm not saying he cheated on me or anything. It's like he didn't do what he said he was going to do. So if I'm the way I was in my 20s, and let's say I would sweep it under the rug, that would be the behavior that I'd do for a while, but I couldn't tolerate it anymore, right? And so the reactive behavior I do comes from the top, which of the top of my side of the infinity. I might be like, well, you didn't do that, and you must not care about me, and what's wrong with you? And, so that might be my behavior. Then it's going to make him feel, and I'm saying make him feel because it's a system. I look at interdependence as kind of a paradox. On the one hand, I can't make him feel anything, but on the other hand, he's going to get triggered with his, attachment wounding. Because he's got to make wrong trigger. He's going to feel made wrong. And so because of that, he's going to interpret that I don't respect him. And then the reactive behavior he's going to have is going to be to withdraw from me. And, be like, I don't want to deal with this, or he'll argue back, pick the day, depending on how he's feeling. And then, of course, that doesn't solve the problem. So then that's why it's an infinity, because then whatever he does will hurt me more, and then I'll feel more not attended to, and then I'll have more reactive behavior. And so it's like this negative cycle. And so usually, if couples are either fighting or distant, they're caught in a negative cycle. And so who I'm getting from him is not really who he is when he feels respected. It's him reacting to me. And so that's why when I change my behavior and I'm vulnerable, then he feels safer with me, and then he'll actually come and connect with me and work it out.
Well, what's interesting? I've developed something called the behavioral transformation ladder, and it goes back to a number of different emotional concepts that people have developed. But what I find interesting is that, and this is in general, but it's, I think, an application to relationships too, is that we tend to, as we're surrounding ourselves with people, and we see this a lot now with social media and what's happening right now with overall culture there in the United States, is that when people are angry, they're frustrated, you see this all the time. What happens is the people that surround them also become upset. In other words, whoever you're with, whatever their emotional level is, you tend to either go down towards that or go up towards that. And I think this is something that's just come to my mind, but I think that there's something of a very subconscious emotional level for people. For instance, as you were growing up and what you went through, what would you say was that doubt? Was that uncertainty? Was that worry? Was that, blame? Was it insecurity? Was it guilt? Was it grief? What was that, would you say, in your own case?
Oh, for me, like in terms of like how I felt in relationship with other people.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of complicated, so it would depend on the situation, but I always felt an underpinning of anxiety before I really learned how to regulate my nervous system.
Okay.
I would say that I had disorganized attachment before I started healing, so that's why I was
Okay.
sort of all across the board.
So I'm going to stop you right there, though, for a minute. So you're at anxiety, okay? And as I look at my ladder, that anxiety is number 14, which is down there, and number one is the top. The ideal place, at least to be, is number 7, where it's at least contentment and stable and so forth. So it's
Yes.
interesting that I think subconsciously we may not even realize that because that underlying emotional level that we're at is below that optimal situation, that then whoever we're with in a relationship is unknowingly, unconsciously being brought down to that level also, which
Yeah.
I think goes to what we were talking about, how one individual in a relationship, literally, if they can raise themselves up on that
Hmm.
emotional level and get to the point where they're at least content, if not really experiencing, positivity and joy and so forth, that as they do that, they start to bring up their partner in a
Yep.
similar way. And I haven't heard people talk about that much. And yet I think that that's a subtlety that exists in these relationships that we don't realize. In fact, as I was interviewing one person and we were talking about emotional intelligence, one of the comments that they made was that they have found studies wise that someone who is highly emotionally intelligent is more successful in life than someone that has a high IQ. And
Yeah.
so I think it's so important for people to understand how important that is.
No, totally. I mean, how I would summarize what you just said is emotions are contagious. you know, which is true. I mean, we have mirror neurons even, but with our attachment partner, the studies show that we influence each other's blood pressure and heart rate and, nervous system regulation. So, yes, it's absolutely true that if I raise my consciousness, to a higher level. In fact, in IPEC, I was trained in a system called energy leadership, which it sounds a little bit similar to the ladder you're talking about because it starts at either anxiety or victim mentality, and then it goes to anger, and then there's above the line where you take responsibility, and then you feel more contentment and more seizing opportunities, and then the higher levels are more spiritual. But so I'll say, as you raise your consciousness or raise your vibration, or you move up the emotional scale, which Esther Hicks talks about, then yes, the people that are the closest to you will be entrained. It's kind of like I look at it like entrainment as like two tuning forks. You hold one tuning fork next to another and it vibrates at a similar frequency. So emotions kind of work the same way. That's how I would sort of vibe off what you're saying.
So how do you help people to recognize number one where they happen to be on that emotional ladder? Okay. But secondarily, how do you help them to identify those what do you call it, emotional triggers that people have that they don't even recognize are literally, in many cases, controlling their lives? How do you take someone that's called you and said, "Hey, I need your help"? How do you help them, number one, to start to identify those emotional triggers?
Yeah, I love that question. And it is different when I work with individuals or couples, because if I work with a couple, then I use the framework that I just mentioned, because it's really cool that infinity loop. I mean, it's called in emotionally focused therapy, it's called your cycle. And we can get positive cycles or negative cycles. Because if I work with a couple, then if they look at the cycle together, they can see how my moves trigger your moves, and then you start blaming the cycle rather than each other, and then you can connect with your feelings and needs and learn emotional intelligence, and you kind of discover your triggers together, which is really nice, because then it's not like you're being each other's therapist, but you're giving each other empathy and compassion for your triggers. And I have an exercise that I lead people through, called the raw spot exercise, which comes from Susan Johnson. So if I work with a couple, they do that together. But if I work with an individual, then we take a look at what was the triggering incident, but it's not about the incident. somebody said something, didn't say something, or didn't say something, or they did something, didn't do something, or, whatever made you upset or angry or anxious or sad or, whatever. So a trigger is something that kind of takes you from feeling good or content or happy, and all of a sudden now you're not happy anymore. You're, upset, or you're, I think upset is kind of the umbrella term. So we take a look at what was it that upset you, but it's not about the outside circumstance. It's what happened in you when that got triggered, and what thoughts went through your head, what feelings happened in your body, what did you make that mean? And what are the patterns? So I have people look at patterns that come up, because a trigger is basically like I have a trigger around being misunderstood, for example. So anytime I'm misunderstood now, of course, I know how to regulate my nervous system, and when I'm triggered, I don't have to get reactive when I'm misunderstood, but I can say I feel misunderstood, and can we talk about that so I feel understood, but it's still a trigger for me. I feel like my heart rate goes up, and I kind of like feel agitated, and because that's been a trigger for me for a really long time. So I have people identify the patterns, like what pattern happens that triggers you, and then how do you feel, and what do you need in those moments. I really help people identify, because a need is not what you need the other person to do. That's what a lot of times we think, that if we need something, we're being needy. And my definition of needy is that you want the other person to change, and that's not what a need is. That's what a strategy is. Like, strategy is if they change, my need to be met, but then that puts the power outside of yourself. So I don't recommend that.
So let me ask you another, let me ask you another question, because as you're working with someone and they identify that, okay, here's the event, which has no emotion. An event does not have an emotion attached to it.
Right.
But I attach an emotion to that, whether it's somebody said something or whatever happens.
Yeah.
And then you identify that, okay, that emotion came up. How often do you use something like NLP to go back and identify where that came from? Where did it originate? And once you get back there, how often can you find that by reframing that into something different, that it all of a sudden changes that reaction and that trigger?
Yeah, that's the really exciting part. So what you're talking about is the phenomenon of memory reconsolidation. So, NLP is, I think, the easiest way that I do that with people. I'm also trained in Hakomi, and so that's kind of like the deeper way of, it just depends on, I think, especially triggers that happen from 0 to, like, the ones that are pre-verbal, like from 0 to 3, let's say, are harder to do with NLP, because you need conscious memories with NLP. But with the Hakomi, which is a somatic healing modality, then we can actually access where that might have come from earlier than that and reprogram it. But what I would say is I always start out, like, that's why I love that I have a variety of tools, because I always start out with the cognitive behavioral approach to reprogram beliefs and patterns. And if that works, great. You don't have to go deeper. I don't need, because I'm a coach, not a therapist. And we're always focusing on what do you want first. And with relationships, what you want is usually, if you're single, to find a partner that makes you feel loved and cherished and adored and respected and, thriving and all of that, and turned on and happy. If you're married, then you probably want to rekindle the passion and the harmony that was there, so what you want is not like a goal, like if I was a business coach, it's more like a goal of how you want to be feeling together. But so that's always what we focus on, is what do you want. But then obviously I help people take action towards what they want, and inevitably these limiting beliefs and patterns sabotage it. So the first way, not inevitably, I have actually coached people that get what they want quickly, And there's one couple I worked with where they started out with all these issues. I thought it was going to be like months of working with me, but after 4 sessions, they were happy again. So, I don't think it has to be complicated, right? But I just have a robust toolkit in case it is. So the first thing I do is the cognitive behavioral approach, where I say, well, what's the limiting belief, or what's the pattern that you want to reprogram? What's the truth? How do you want to feel? What do you need to believe in order to feel that way? What's evidence that belief is true? What action would you take, right? So that's the coaching approach, right? And I would say that works in a fair amount of cases, but if that doesn't work, it certainly doesn't work for me very well. Just because my wounds are a little nuanced. Then we'll start with the NLP pattern of re-imprinting, which I love, or timeline therapy, as it's also referred to. Right. So it's kind of like it always starts with disidentifying from it. So it's not like you get re-traumatized if you bring up the memory and relive it. So it's not about that. It's about kind of seeing it on a movie screen, usually. But with the Hakomi of experiential, the experiential modality, then if it feels safe, then you can kind of feel what you were feeling back then, but you don't have to. Especially in NLP, it can be about seeing it as a movie screen. And what did you need back then? And imagine that it went differently.
Well, and it's interesting. I actually have experienced NLP, and I've experienced the other two. I don't know what they call it, but I actually went back, and for me at least, my perception is that I heard my parents talking while I was in the womb, and something that my mother said to my dad, and because I identify with my dad, that became that limiting belief for me. And so I think it's important for people to understand and realize that, we can be so affected by things we don't even realize we can be affected by. Yeah. And so we're running out of time. We could go on for quite a while on this one. But as we get close to the end, what would be one tidbit of information and thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience? What would that message be?
Yeah, I love that you said that. Gosh, I'm still kind of focused on what you just said. I mean, I want to validate it. But so the message that I would say is that no matter what, you can attract healthy, happy love. It is really not your fault if you're caught in unhealthy patterns, because we just don't know our own blind spots. But if we do know how to be emotionally intelligent, how to know what we need instead of what we want, and focus on being solution focused, like really approaching other people from a collaborative space and talking about our feelings and needs in a really attuned way, then, we'll only be attracted to other people that are emotionally available. And if you're in a marriage, then if you change and you show up in a different way, your partner can change, and you can have the relationship that you had when you first got together. So it's all possible.
Great. Yeah. So how do people find you?
Well, my website is coachvaleriegreen.com. So that's CoachValerie, and Green has an E at the end of it. So coachvaleriegreen.com. And I actually do have 4 free gifts. So if you go on my webpage under the free ebooks trainings tab, I have information no matter whether you're single, partnered, and also I have an entire ebook on how to work through your limiting beliefs and patterns that we talked about. So that's the healing one. So I just love to share these tools with the world.
Well, Valerie, thank you so much. You know what? I appreciate what you're doing so much. I think to be able to realize that what your experiences have brought you to the point where you are now giving back, that you're really helping people, and particularly relationships are so important in our lives. And to be able to help people to understand how, if they can change their own level of, as you say, emotional intelligence, and get rid of some of those, not get rid, but identify those triggers and modify the effect that they have on us, that can change so much the relationships we have with others. So thank you so much for
Yeah.
for being on the show.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's just, it is my deepest privilege to be able to help people with their relationships. So I
Well, I
appreciate that.
appreciate it. And folks, thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Look forward to having you join us again soon. This is Dr. Doug saying namaste.
Namaste.
Every conversation on this podcast eventually comes back to that same question, not how do I get more, but is this actually who I am? If something you heard today moved you just a little closer to an honest answer, that is enough. I'm Dr. Doug. This is Inspire Vision. Until next time.